I just checked, and as I'm recording, it appears as the 13th attempt by Kevin McCarthy to become Speaker is about to unfold. Of course, the horror of this is that Kevin McCarthy keeps giving away everything that the speakership is supposed to include in order to get his name up on the wall in some part of the Capitol that says at one time he was the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. But every time they have a break where Kevin and his crew can try to convince the people, the Christian Nazis who have infiltrated our government, trying to convince them that he should be Speaker. Every time they do that, he has to give away more and more and more until there's going to be nothing left except Kevin McCarthy being able to hold the gavel. I mean, that's going to be it. Be able to sit behind the president and next to the vice president. He will have about as much power with the U.S. House as I do, or as you do. This is what is happening. Woo! I want to share with you something also that was written today by Catherine Miller. You can find it in the Times. And she points out something that I'm sure you're familiar with now. I've heard it so many times. But what's happening in Washington, the House being unable to elect a speaker on the first ballot. Boy, is that ancient. But it's happened only 15 times in the nation's history that it wasn't accomplished on the first ballot. And in the last few days, during Kevin McCarthy's continuing the surreal attempt to become the leader of the House, two particular failed votes from the past have come up. The previous one in 1923 that we've all heard about. This hadn't happened in 100 years. And then the most drawn out one that occurred in 1856, which we have now, I think, gone even further. It began in 1855 and it ended in 1856. So what I'm talking about now, that's when the House required, I guess I'm wrong. It required 133 ballots to name a speaker. 133 ballots, which had the effect of totally demolishing the U.S. Congress for months. Oh my God, the legislative branch of government did not exist. And eventually the lawmakers, since they couldn't come up with the necessary majority requirement, they agreed to select a speaker by plurality. And if you think about the date, a failed vote back then makes sense in the context of what was happening in the country at that time. The debate over the speaker reflected the debate about the expansion of slavery into new territories. This is what I was talking about before the break. What the framers did by not eliminating slavery altogether, or considering enslaved people to be fully human, or having gotten involved in the initiation of slavery to begin with. I don't mean Washington, Adams, the rest of them. I mean the first whites that settled in somebody else's country here. But the debate over the speaker reflected what was going on in the country, the expansion of slavery into these new territories. And as Catherine writes, 4 of the 15 failed votes in history took place between 1847 and the beginning of the Civil War. And the country was deadlocked, but in the process of breaking apart over the central problem of American history, and that is the enslavement of other human beings. Catherine points out that since the Civil War, this has happened only one other time, and that was in 1923. And that vote, according to what I've read, failed because a group of progressive Midwestern Republicans, initially refused to back the more conservative Republican Speaker for the House for re-election. And she points out that in the 1920s, the Republican Party shifted to become the party of Calvin Coolidge. and all that entailed with limited government, protectionism, isolation. But in the broader sense, thinking about that time period, deadlock, unable to find a speaker, makes sense for the 1920s because that was a time when there was massive urbanization beginning to happen, technological innovation, and immigration had changed the country, and it was a period that included the rise of these weird coalitions of Americans that produced, for example, the Prohibition, which set about creating the most crime-saturated period in American history, which is still continuing. Also, that period produced a racist backlash against Black Americans and European immigrants. I've told you the story, and it's in my book, about how my grandparents, who came from Italy at the turn of the 19th century to the 20th, and how they didn't change their last names, but they tried everything they could to diminish their visibility. They dropped Catholicism and became Protestant. They joined a Baptist church in a small town, it was a small town at the time, Findlay, Ohio, where my grandfather set up his gasoline station and tire business. But they had to be careful. They were immigrants, and they were considered colored immigrants. That was a term used because they were from Southern Europe. They weren't white. I know that sounds ridiculous. So there's a comparison between the 1850s and the 1920s. You can see the outlines of a framework where what Ms. Miller calls the fractured operation of government reflected the fractures that were going on a social level in this country. Immigrants, colored folk. I mean, it was a crazy period, both periods, 1850s, 1920s. But here we are in 2023, and Kevin McCarthy's willingness to stand on the floor for failed vote after failed vote after failed vote after failed vote has this insane quality as anything you might see on television or Twitter. It's surreal. I was having lunch today with my daughter, who's 18. She is a couple of the courses she's taking at university. It's political science, political history. And she has a working knowledge of the politics of this country, the political history of this country. But we sat there and watched these vote after vote after vote while we talked about it, Molly and me. And she was just dumbfounded, like, Daddy, how can this be happening? And in order for me to answer that, I would have to sit her down and spend the next 3 months, and I trying to explain it. And I just say, when do you get back to class? You know, your professor, I'm sure, will go through all of this for you, because she goes to a very liberal school that does talk about race history in this country. Anyway, during the 3 days, 4 days now, nothing meaningful has changed where it concerns trying to get Kevin McCarthy into the speakership. But as Catherine points out, the impasse and repetition is mesmerizing. Operating in a space between institutional concern, dark comedy, and some deep human element, since the dynamics of this willingness to lose are so unusual. Now, what's she talking about? Well, yesterday morning, McCarthy told reporters, quote, "We are going to go in here and have votes and nothing is going to change. What we are doing is having really good progress in conversations," end quote. What? What was happening? And you don't need a columnist in the New York Times to tell you this. If you're watching this, you can see it yourself. What was happening is every time they took the vote, Kevin McCarthy lost more support. Now, it's my understanding today he snatched back 7 or 8 of the people who had been, 12 of the people who had been voting against his ascension to the speakership. But by the time you hear this, God only knows what the situation is going to be. But this whole thing, it's finally occurred to me. This is like doing bad acid. It's a hallucination that you just, you try to tell yourself this is not real. I've had experiences on mind-altering drugs where I had to somehow say to myself, I don't know how I did it. I really don't care how I did it, but I did it. This is not real, Mike. This is not real, Mike. Just sit calmly. Just sit calmly. And I've had a couple of moments like that watching this insane shit on television. It's a hallucination. And as Catherine does point out, you can see on Twitter that screenshot of the Republican staff email subject line that said, canceled, grab-and-go pizza and salads. What? Or you can watch Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stand outside the Capitol with an incoming member of Congress and talk about, and she's laughing, I don't blame her, how nobody knows what to do. What? Now, the truth is, as I'm recording this, there are no actual members of the U.S. House of Representatives because under normal rules, the winners of the November elections can't be sworn in until there's a speaker. Now, Kevin McCarthy, as we all know or should know at this point, this crazy bastard moved everything he has in the Capitol into the Speaker's office, out of his old office, even though he isn't the Speaker. Oh, Jesus. Catherine writes, in 20 years, there will be enough historical context for this that someone can see it took place in 2023 and immediately understand why. And that is the way that we do now, what we do now when we see those votes from the 1850s and the 1920s. There are some raw similarities. Those are my words, not hers. And you can definitively say that these fractured votes this week, that if you've been watching on television, it's just as stunning to you as it has been to me, that they have occurred during several unusually turbulent years, to say the least, and that they reflect the madness that has taken, the political madness that has taken over the political class in this country. Now, political class, of which I'm not a part, neither are you, but what they are not doing is affecting all of us. It's affecting the country. It's affecting our standing in the country. And I'm surprised there hasn't been some overt move by one of America's endless list of enemies to really cause some shit while this is going on. So far, it hasn't happened. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. You know, the Progressive Voices Network brings you commercial-free commentary from today's leading progressive radio hosts and pundits, like me, Mike Malloy, 24 hours a day. I'm not your typical old guy from the 80s or the 90s talk radio host, and Progressive Voices is not your typical talk radio network. It's a listener-supported nonprofit with no corporate control whatsoever over our broadcast. So hosts like me, Mike Malloy, are free to rant and scream and carry on about whatever we like. We're often controversial, but we're never boring. Weeknights, 9 p.m. in the East, 6 p.m. in the West on the Progressive Voices Network. Always progressive, always on. I'm Mike Malloy. Keep it lit.